Hello everyone, today we talk about the blonde-haired peoples from Maurice Strategikon or Strategicon, which is a manual of the late 6th century, which seems to have been written within the milieu of the Constantinopolitan court at the time. So it's essentially a military treaty, or better, it's been defined also as a manual of war, and it's one of the most extraordinary documents that we have from that age, especially regarding the warfare of that time, late antique or maybe already early medieval, if you prefer. If you have never read it, I really urge you to do so if you like that period, because it's an extraordinary work. It's not very difficult to understand it. I unfortunately cannot speak Greek. I can understand it a little from the ancient sources and so on, but I never had the fortune of translating it from the original, so you will forgive me if today I will make some mistake, because essentially I want to talk about the passage, the chapter actually, or the paragraph that interests us today. But it's also a very simple, simply written manual. It has a mainly pragmatic and practical aim. And it's extraordinary because it basically talks about Byzantine or Roman, if you prefer, army tactics of that time, and organization and training. So drilling, marching, logistics, tactics of various kinds, open battles, sieges, and so on. But it's also extraordinary because it tells a lot also about other peoples that in the manual enter as those enemies that the Romans were fighting at the time. And thanks to this, the Strategikon basically narrates the ancient ethnographical interests towards the various peoples of the world, or at least the ones in here that the Romans were interacting with militarily, and it describes each one of these peoples from their warfare, essentially. It is extraordinary because it basically shows really the intellectual superiority of the Roman Empire at these times, compared to the rest of these peoples, which is a typically Byzantine thing, the idea of understanding your enemy if you want to win him. There will be a lot of things to say about the work in general, but today I would like to focus, as I was saying, on this chapter that you can find in the Strategikon that is explicitly dedicated to the so-called blonde-haired peoples. Now, who were these guys? First of all, there is a debate regarding to this already to address for a minute, because I've seen around that normally, I don't know, this comes from a certain historiographical judgment, then eventually echoed and was taken as the average interpretation of this passage, that the blonde peoples at this point were mainly the Franks. I mean, not because they were blonde, but the kind of peoples that the Byzantines were referring to. Telling the truth, and the Franks and Lombards, but especially the Franks. Now, first of all, I would like to dispel this idea, at least in my opinion, because the Strategikon is definitely addressing a large a large ethnic community. They're not talking about one specific people as a kingdom or a confederation. They're talking about the Germanic peoples of those times. So Franks and Lombards are included anyway. But at the moment in which the Strategikon was being written, the people with whom the Byzantines were interacting the most and extensively in its most intense way historically at this point were the Longobards. What I mean is that the Longobards at this time were both fighting against and within the Byzantine army, because they had just invaded Italy, and there were certain Longobards that were fighting against the Romans and some that instead went fighting for the Romans. And we know of extensive numbers of Longobards included into the Byzantine army at this point, fighting. I don't know, I think there were thousands of Longobards sent to the Armenian front by Constantinople, other Longobard leaders even fighting in today's Bulgaria, and others just waging war against their kindreds in Italy itself. So it was a very big movement of Longobards at that time within the Byzantine world, and while the Franks were really detached from it. Telling the truth, because they were allies of the Byzantines at this point, exactly against the Longobards, but there was no significant warfare occurring between the Byzantines and the Franks. The only major encounter between Franks and Byzantines at this point, I think, was at the very last stages of the Gothic War, when the Franks and the Alemanni launched a very deep ride up to down to southern Italy, and were eventually defeated by Narses at that point. But the Byzantines weren't really fighting with the Franks, and what their mind was set on, telling the truth, were the Longobards. So I will take the Strategicon's chapter on the blonde-haired people as mostly a description of Longobards warfare. That, however, can be definitely expanded to most Germanic peoples at this time. Let's remember that at this point the Danubian frontier doesn't see Germanic peoples anymore. There were already the Slavs, the Avars, so really the only people at that point the Byzantines were fighting against that was Germanic were the Longobards. I will, at the end of the video, I will also talk about the so-called Italian maneuver, for this very reason, because it's another chapter of the Strategikon that talks about this Italian maneuver, which is, by the way, seemingly a quite important one, because it's meant to be for habitual use. It says the manual, and it was evidently named after, I believe, what was being currently the warfare in Italy at that point against the Longobards, and therefore can make us a bit better understand maybe what kind, not just what these blonde-haired people fought like, but what kind of maneuver was advised to counter them, and it should be really this Italian maneuver. However, these were tactical models that could be applied to different peoples as well, and there is a great interchangeability of these tactics. It's just a name. It was taking the name from Italy, but it could be carried out against in other places and against different foes than once the empire was fighting in Italy at that time. So I'd say we can just begin to read the Strategikon regarding the blonde-haired people, and the translation of the in English is mine. So if you spot any mistake, or you wanna make a bit of you wanna give a bit of an advice, if you're an expert, that is surely warmly welcome. So as I was saying before, this chapter is part of a list of other chapters talking each one about a different people. There are the Avars, there are the Slavs, there are the Persians, etc. So here we're talking instead about the Germanic peoples were, and it's interesting that they are called the peoples with blonde hair, because it's very stereotypical in many ways. I mean, it's not that these peoples, for these peoples, wouldn't be frequent to have blonde hair. As a matter of fact, here in the background picture we have a guy with red hair, which is, you know, but there would be other peoples who could be blonde at this point, like the Slavs, for instance, or but it's still interesting that the Byzantines decided to define the Germans in this fashion, because they could have even written, you know, the Alamanoi, like the Germans, as they called the Germanic peoples. No, they prefer to say, you know, the one with blonde hair. And I think there is also an ethnographical reason for this that goes a bit in parallel with military affairs, because actually in the Germanic military culture, the long hair were a matter of pride for a warrior, and they kind of symbolized the same warrior's strength. So it was very important for these guys to be wearing long hair, and being presumably often blonde, they, you know, they were named in this fashion by the Romans. And it's very interesting. Let's finally the textile. So, the peoples with blonde hair place great importance in the values of freedom. They are brave and intrepid in battle. Being arrogant and impetuous, they consider any fear and even a brief retreat as a misfortune. They despise death with tranquility, as they fight with fury hand to hand, both on horseback and on foot. If they are put in difficulty in a cavalry action, they dismount to an agreed signal and line up on foot. Even if they are only a few and fighting against many cavalrymen, they do not retreat from combat. They are armed with shields, spears, and short swords hanging from behind. They prefer to fight on foot and perform fast charges. So this is the first paragraph, and there are a number of very interesting points. First of all, it's extremely fascinating that the Romans were recognizing beyond any doubt, because this had been a very old stereotype, that the Germans would be extremely brave individually in battle. You can understand that the first thing that is being said about these people is exactly this, that they have a great value of freedom, they're brave, intrepid, are arrogant, impetuous, and they consider any fear a misfortune. And we know that this is true actually from many other sources. The Germanic military traditions strongly stressed and emphasized the idea that a warrior who fled was basically already dead, socially speaking. From Tacitus' Germania, we know, as a matter of fact, that this was the case, that the guy who had retreated into battle, showed any form of cowardly, would not be accepted by their society, his own society, and he would be completely ignored, and his fate was just to hang himself for shame. So this idea that of dying, because of dying as something you can be careless of, because in a certain sense it was a privilege to die for your tribe, etc., is something very important, because in a certain sense it compensated the lack of collective training that these peoples had. It's typical of more primitive cultures, the one especially of tribal nature, to compensate the lack of a common discipline given by someone. In the case of the Roman Empire, it was given by the state that trained these professional soldiers to be legionaries and fight, etc. For the Germans, there was no chief actually imposing that, because They had a kind of society that really despised form of centralized power. Also in here we will be seeing that the Germans didn't like to be commanded by anyone, and essentially the only loyalty they had, ideally, was towards their own clan, their own family. So this idea of being rejected by your own family if you're a coward, it was something that these peoples probably developed because it was their only form of moral commitment they could have for during a battle in terms of discipline and cohesion, etc. And this was extremely important because, as we will be seeing, these Germans fought not in formations or other forms of unit, but by clans, essentially. Another interesting aspect is the fact here that the text stresses that these Germanic peoples could fight both on horseback and on foot. And that where they put into difficulty in a cavalry action, they dismounted to an agreed signal, so it would be something usual, at least from what the text is saying, is suggesting, to fight on foot. Now this is very important because we are very far from that heavy cavalry that would be formed into the High Middle Ages that basically constantly fought on horseback, although we must say that throughout the whole Middle Ages cavalrymen were always trained to fight even on foot. And at this point cavalry was a bit weaker than it would be in the future. So it was, obviously being on horseback gives you some advantage of sorts, and these people seemingly were good cavalrymen as well, because they had been mixing during the migration era with peoples coming from the steppes and really absorbing part of their military culture. But yet, in certain conditions, it was better to fight on foot, because it was a sort, especially probably in defense. Here it says if they're put into difficulty, so if they are taking hits substantially, they prefer to dismount, and this proves essentially that on foot they could resist better to an enemy assault, which is really the case, because cavalry by definition cannot defend, and dismounting and fighting on foot is a good way to reverse that situation. But it's interesting that for these peoples there is a clear understand that they could do both things, because essentially all the peoples at these times had some form of cavalry. But there would be certain peoples that would fight regularly or preferably on foot, like others. So the point that these guys excuse me, are described as doing interchangeably the same thing means that it was very normal to switch things, and that it was part of a form of warfare that would remain actually quite common throughout the world Middle Ages in Europe. That is, the idea that a knight is completely prepared also to dismount and fight on foot. And at this point, here it says, even if they are only a few and they're fighting against many cavalrymen, they do not retreat from combat. So also here, a very interesting information that basically means that that these guys were meant to fight to the death, and that is quite interesting because especially when you're surrounded by cavalry, or at least cavalry can have a great advantage on you. If you break your formation, there are not great chances you can survive, because at that point you lose the only advantage that could come from a thick, compact formation, and basically getting hunted down by cavalry. So these guys had it clear, very, very clear in mind, and they knew that the only way to make it out, if there was any, was in any in any way to fight at that point on foot when overwhelmed by cavalry. And this is very interesting because these Germanic peoples had a great relation with peoples like the Huns, previously with the Sarmatians, so they really knew what they were doing. You know, they had met probably some of the fiercest horsemen existing in early medieval warfare at that time, and they knew that the best thing to counter them was to meet them on foot. In absence of an equal military system based largely or exclusively on cavalry that they didn't have, because there is also a lot of debate here of how much mounted peoples the Germanic ones were. We often say that peoples like the Ostrogoths or the Lombards had this very strong steppes influence, for which we don't really know, neither from history nor archaeology, how many of them really fought on horseback on a regular basis, and how many on foot. And my personal opinion is that they probably all knew how to ride a horse. Most of them surely knew how to ride one in battle, but a very few of them could afford really a war horse and fighting regularly on horseback. And from the few things we know, archaeologically speaking, it's very likely that most of these peoples most of the people who made up Lombards, for instance, would fight on foot on a regular basis, and that cavalry made up just a minor fraction of the whole army. And in later Lombard history, we know that from the recruitment laws that were present to the Lombard kingdom, that only the top guys, with the wealthiest one, were required to fight on horseback. Then followed the spearmen on foot, and then the archers. It's also very interesting that these people seemingly had archers, and quite big masses of them that were, that represented the poorest stratum of the population. They mostly were serfs or slaves, maybe integrated from other peoples that had basically been spoiled, deprived of all their wealth, and that would be progressively reabsorbed into society at a point within the freeman class. But it's still very interesting because in migration era warfare, the idea of having many archers on foot was also a pretty good way to counter the enemy horse archers. And this can suggest that how the Germanic peoples, especially the eastern ones, or at least the ones who had more contact with the steppe peoples, had modified consistently their military tradition from the origins to counter that enemy. Here we've read a few news about the equipment. These guys were armed with shields, spears, and short swords hanging from behind. Now, this was the basic equipment of a Germanic warrior at that time. Shield, spear, and here it says just short swords, which were the so-called sacs or scramasacs. And it's interesting because it says short swords hanging from behind. So these were not really it was not hanging from their belt like a normal sword, like a spada, that however these people still widely use at this time. And it's very interesting because it suggests that, as it will be said even afterwards, that these guys preferred mostly spears to fight, and spears, contrarily-wise to common prejudices, were actually more effective than long swords at this point. And the basic Germanic warrior this time would use a spear as a primary weapon into battle. The spear was the symbol of Germanicity or Germanity, I don't know how to say that. In fact, the same word German actually derives from ger, which means spear, and man. So technically the Germans were the men of the spear, so they even took their name from the same weapon. And here the short sword is, as we were saying, is the scramasax, and it was minor. Actually, the length of the sax could vary. It could be a small, very small knife for cutting, I don't know, wood or animal skins, as it could be even a very long sword, like 70 centimeters sometimes. The Longobards, as we knew, had something like that. At least it's witnessed at the beginning of the 7th century, when they were already settled down into Italy, which is interesting because someone even suggested that these sacs had lengthened during the staying in Italy, but I don't really agree with that. I think it's just that we have such a few archaeological finds that we can't make a structural statistics because of that. And longer sacks and scramasax were extremely instead useful as sabers, practically, for cavalry warfare, and it's perfectly plausible that they were very long, still at this time, in which Longobards had come into Italy from a very recent past spent into Central and Eastern Europe, where cavalry warfare was quite of a thing. Italy has a pretty nasty terrain in many ways, although I'm sure in the Po Valley there were enough plains, dry plains for Longobards cavalry to fight, and we know they made extensive use of cavalry already at that point. But it's interesting that here the Byzantines are not naming the longsword, the spada. Yeah, this can actually explain, because we have to think, telling the truth, that that a spada would be extremely expensive at these times. The second half of the 6th century is a very meager time. The Justinian plague had already hit. The whole Western society was kind of shrinking. Material culture is extremely poor at this time, so it would be probably here the treaty is correct. The treaty is correct because most of these Germanic warriors maybe weren't enough rich to afford a spada, and would simply fight with a spear and a short sword. Very interesting. Although I must say that from what we know from archaeological finds, the Longobards, for the Longobards, it would be pretty standard to have a spada among their weaponry. We know that from grave goods, and let's say that at least when they came into Italy, the average Longobards freeman had a spada in his gear. So this is very interesting. And another thing that it doesn't say here is that in many Longobards graves we find bow and arrows, which tells you how much steppe influence there was in there. Telling the truth, it would be normal in many ways to have bow and arrow even in at the end of the migration era into Europe. It was a weapon that the Germans didn't like very much, because they consider it as a sort of cowardly weapon, because a guy could kill someone on the distance without fighting him manly hand to hand. But it would be extremely widespread in all eras, because, you know, for hunting, first of all, you know, the Longobards and this time would be extremely self-sufficient in terms of logistics. They would essentially they had the local families could provide for their own food quite autonomously, and hunting would be one of their primary activities for feeding themselves, and obviously bow and arrows would be the basics for hunting at that point. So and in this sense it might be that at this point the Byzantines were, well, I don't know really if this is the case, but maybe this is just my suggestion, maybe the Franks made a slightly less extensive use of bows and arrows than peoples like the Longobards that instead had more Eastern influences. So maybe here, but it's just speculation. Who wrote the treatise was thinking of a broader picture of the Germans and not just in particular of the Longobards that they knew best. And here the conclusion of the paragraph is extremely fascinating. It says they prefer to fight on foot and perform fast charges. So here it kind of solves partially some of the problem of how did they really fight. Was it mostly on horseback or on foot? It was definitely on foot, and I definitely agree. I think that these peoples weren't like horse riding peoples. They made extensive use of cavalry, but still the large majority of freemen would fight on foot. And here it even says they prefer to fight on foot, because cavalry at this point didn't have that shock power that it would have in feudal Europe, so it was even more profitable and more convenient to fight on foot most of the times. And here it also says they prefer they perform fast charges, which is something that the Germans always did historically, since the very first ethnographic treatises that talk about them tell us, because there is actually a reason for this, and that will be clearer probably later. Because these peoples had poor logistics, so what they achieved was mostly to give this first single big shot with a charge with all their strengths, and to break the enemy immediately, because they didn't have many other resources to spend in the campaign, logistically speaking, to remain for a very long time on a strategic theater, and the idea of spending all the strengths in one shot and breaking the enemy was the favorite tactics, and this had worked actually more than once against the Roman legions in the past, and the Romans really feared these charges because they were capable really of breaking quite easily a formation that didn't have enough discipline, etc. So just the Roman legions most of the times could meet these encounter these charges successfully. And here it doesn't say it, but probably these guys also made extensive use of javelins, and especially before the charge. We know at least several Germanic peoples in the late antique times did, even copying the Roman heavy javelin in order to achieve exactly that. I mean, softening up the enemy front ranks and then assaulting them with this very impetuous charge, hoping to break their lines at the first impact. So let's continue reading the second paragraph. So both on foot and on horseback they line up for battle, not in a pre-established manner or formation, nor in small units nor divisions, but for tribes, each one united, reunited with the other, the akin ones, by common interests. So here it's obviously describing the fact that there would be certain bonds between clans at various levels. These Germanic confederations of the migration era were essentially an alliance of several tribes. That was a pretty messy business, telling the truth, because there was really no centralized authority. At this stage, the Longobards still largely lacked a world national cohesion. They fought on the basis of clans for their own interest. So here it says that even at a tactical level, they don't follow an organization based on units or divisions, but that substantially they enter the field with their own clans, divided it up in clans, and sometimes even more clans joined together. And this is what I was talking about before. I mean, the idea that the internal discipline of these units would be assured by the the relations that existed within these peoples. If you're fighting with your own family, you surely have someone to die for next to you and to defend them. And here it explains it, because it says, often, as a result, when things are not going well and their friends have been killed, they will risk their lives fighting to avenge them. Now, this is quite interesting, because here it's putting the emphasis on the vendetta kind of typical of the Germanic peoples, like avenging the murder of one of their friends. Here they say friends. I would like to see the Greek term. But yeah, that goes also for your relatives. I mean, you would shield your relatives into battle. You would be eager to defend and to protect them, and eventually to avenge them. So they would be fueled also in terms of more resources by hatred coming from the loss of a friend or a relative that had been slaughtered by the enemy, and that is quite a pretty good gluing factor in terms of moral. I can't say of discipline, but of moral, that can maybe compensate in some ways. Here it says, and this is what I wanted to say. Here it says, in combat, they formed the front of their battle line in a compact and uniform way. Now, this is very interesting, because there is the stereotype that the barbarians in general had, didn't fight into an ordered line, or that they were kind of fighting everyone on their own individually. This is completely false. The Germanic warrior was definitely capable of performing great feats even in individual fights, for which he was probably one of the best warriors of the time. But as we know, fighting alone doesn't pay very much. So they would form a battle line that was at least very compact and uniform, which means that they clearly understood the idea that if you want to meet an enemy, you have to have solid ranks that do not have particular heterogeneity to be exploited by the enemies through gaps and something like that. So here we find probably the idea of a shield wall, or something that at least resembles that, and quite evidently, and we know that from extensively also from other sources. And after that, there are other hints in the same Strategikon, and therefore they make a strong body mass of troops. So here it continues and says, both on horseback and on foot, they are impetuous and unruly in charge, as if they were the only people in the world not to be cowardly. This is very poetic. It's my favorite line from this chapter, telling the truth. But I think it's more interesting what it says at the beginning. because it's say both on horseback and on foot, they are impetuous and unruly in charge. So this means that this is also a typical Germanic stereotype. The idea that when they charged, they had a very strong impetus, but they were unruly, which is very important because here it says how poor collective discipline they really had. In the Germanic world, this idea of the warrior that met the enemy was the first one to meet the enemy ranks in battle was kind of an obsession of these peoples, because from one side they recognized that having this internal competition could be dangerous for the complexive success of tactics, because if anyone thought in their own way, that they would have lost order quite quickly. But at the same time, we're extremely proud of of showing their own individual prowess in running as fast as they could against the enemy. And this could be absorbed in part by the idea that a strong and fast charge, as we have seen it before, could really, be a collective run towards the enemy, and we have to think it in that fashion. The main objective was having this body mass running quite fast and impacting very hard against the enemy ranks to break them. You have to think it's something very physical at this point, men pushing one against the other and making a sort of terrible collective effort to break the enemy line. But at the same time, the fact that here it says that they were unruly, it also means that there was probably there were certain problems relatively to it, because it could happen, I don't know, that one clan charged before the others and the whole formation lost coordination, and the same charge could fail because of that. And I'm pretty much convinced that, and there are many examples. Actually, in Lombard history there is an episode that is narrated by Paul the Diacon, into which certain Lombards and the Duke of Friuli basically challenged one guy, telling him that he was a coward telling the truth, it was the other way around. He had insulted this guy because he said that he was a coward, and this guy told him, who was not a coward at all, by the way. So this guy answered him, okay, so let's prove who is the most coward between me and you, and let's charge the enemy. Now, the enemy was a Slavic garrison placed on the top of a hill, a very hard position to take, and basically the Duke of Friuli went after this guy with all the rest of the Lombard ducal forces, and the whole Lombard army got slaughtered by the Slavs, who were just pouring stones over their heads while they were running uphill. And this happened quite later than when this Strategikon was composed, so we can guess that at this time maybe such excesses, whether, I don't know, maybe they're just topoi, or just like in the work of Paul the Diacon, but maybe it was actually a problem for these guys to be quite undisciplined in charges, and therefore collectively suffering of uncoordination and of defeat ultimately, because timing and coordination is really everything. On the other hand, we know that probably were certain good leaders that knew how not to do that, and in fact, into Germanic military culture, the kind of the wise commander is very prized. A wise commander that is usually also older, so he's not so young, he has not so much testosterone like once, so he can maybe reflect more coldly and still, keeping the younger warriors calm under his authority. And this was really it, because you have to think that the clan leaders at this point would be the older men, and they would have the full command of these clans. So it wouldn't be so strange to see, I don't know, these old guys that they usually led from the battlefront, because they had still theoretically to show that they were the most courageous of the clan, but maybe some youngers running before them, which was something terrible, because that could cause a domino effect and let all the other and push all the other warriors to run after them and lose any coordination and order, and causing the disaster. And this has been already the problem basically of every army in history ever. We're not just talking about the Germanic peoples, but it's very interesting to see how civilization also passes and is measurable in warfare through this the ability of these groups to actually contain such individualistic behaviors, and trying to be more disciplined overall. And this was the great difference between the Germans at this point and the Romans, because the Romans were like the epitome of the disciplined armies, of the disciplined soldiers, but the Germans were recognized as the most courageous ones by the same Romans, as we've seen, but also as substantially completely unruly and incapable of keeping discipline, and very untrained, etc. So this is really the major stereotype. As a matter of fact, here in the Strategikon, the blonde-haired peoples are the ones who basically, as we will be seeing, suffered most of this lack of discipline among all the other peoples. Yet they compensated with individual valor, and seemingly this worked in many ways, and we will see here. See it now. Here, beautiful, the world, as if they were the only people in the world not to be cowardly. This is what they really believed, genuinely. The Germans didn't have any inferiority complex towards anyone whatsoever. They believed they were truly the most courageous peoples in the world because they were Germans. This is something we find in historical sources many times, and it's really a characteristic cultural trait of the Germans, still at this time in history. Here, quite simply, they do not obey their leaders. What I was saying before. I mean, the fact that they completely they were unruly. They didn't like to be commanded. They didn't like, especially, the idea that that there was a freeman giving orders to another freeman, because they thought they were all freemen. And even though they elected war leaders, they still looked at them in a way, yeah, you might be a good leader of men, but still, when in times of peace, you are still like one of the others, and with no exception. So it's very political in many ways, and though not a very good thing in warfare. Then it continues, it says, they are little interested in everything that is complicated and place little attention to external security and personal interest. This is completely true. The Germans lagged substantially behind the Romans in forms of logistical organization, of security. They didn't have proper camps. They didn't care, because they thought, in perspective, that the only possible fight was the manly one. One against one, an army in the face of the other, and that was it. And obviously, they were completely aware that this kind of warfare wasn't the real one, because they also were pretty sneaky. They liked to do ambushes and so on. but in terms of here it says they're little interested in everything that is complicated. So even the idea of organizing a plan, a complex plan, was something very distant from their minds. And this was interesting to know to be known by the Romans, because they kind of underestimated them under this point of view. Yeah, here external security and personal interest, even, for which I would better like to understand what it really means, because personal interest is like, yeah, you can be an uncautious person, maybe you don't put up guards, etc., but here it's at an individual level. Maybe they were here it's saying that they were particularly bold, so not to mind about ambushes or enemies acting sneakily towards them, etc. Then it says they despise good order, especially on horseback. Being greedy, they are easily corruptible with money. Now the thing of horseback, here it says it's basically saying that that the Germanic equestrian abilities weren't not that much. I mean, individually maybe they surely had a kind of they probably were good individual cavalrymen, but they preferred to have better order on foot. And this is really something, yeah, because the Germans, originally speaking, had a very few cavalry, and their military tradition had mostly been about infantry. Then they were by receiving the influences of the steppes, had integrated cavalry into their armies in consistent numbers, but probably they didn't live like the nomadic peoples at the point of having a good collective training of cavalry formations, and this was pretty much obvious. So their charges were on horseback were probably disordered, and nothing to be extremely surprised by, because before the professionalization of cavalry, but in Carolingian times it was very hard to see very ordered cavalry units in Western warfare. They would be something hybrid, as we've seen, between cavalrymen who could dismount or javeliners, skirmishers, etc. The heavy cavalry that requires very good order and collective training and cohesion wasn't really much there. Although there could be exceptions, I'm sure there were pretty good ordered cavalry formations, even in the Lombard army. And relatively to their greediness, they are easily corruptible with money. Hell yeah. The Byzantines at this time were buying literally half of the Lombard people by saying, hey, come and join us, we will pay you. And they said sure, and so it was. They weren't particularly attached to their own national unity. As a matter of fact, they probably didn't have it, aside from the needs that the migration era had entailed in order to build up confederations, etc. They preferred to be individually autonomous in many ways, and therefore it was easy to corrupt them with money. And they didn't have, let's say, a centralized authority to be faithful to, even in forms of interest. Eventually they would become instead, because when the Lombards built up the kingdom, eventually they would be pretty united, at least in the north that was under the kings. Here we go to the other paragraph, and it says they do not tolerate pain and fatigue. Although their spirits are bold and daring, their bodies are weak and spoiled, and they are not able to bear the pain firmly. they are also put in difficulty by heat, cold, rain, and lack of provisions, especially wine, and by the postponement of battle. This is a very old stereotype that the Romans owned towards the Germans, because for the Romans, the Roman soldier was used, thanks to training, to every form of deprivement, of fatigue, of privation, I meant. And while the Germans were usually depicted as larger and extremely strong, they were also seen in a certain sense as soft and not capable of enduring pain and sufferance for a long time. This is really kind of a stereotype. It's not that the Germans at this time could endure certain conditions worse or better than the Romans, in my opinion. If anything, it's possible that living in more in more savage, in wilder environments than the Romans, they had probably they were more used to be exposed to things like cold and certain other deprivations. But at the same time, they were surely capable of sacrifice. But what here the Romans are meaning, because they were extremely proud and probably also untrue, or better, unjust towards the Germans, is a matter of logistics. Here the point is that it's not that the Romans lasted more than the Germans without towards heat, cold, rain, lack of provisions, etc. It's that the Romans had such things. So even if it was cold and or too hot, etc., they still had to drink, to eat. On average, they had a better logistical system that could feed them. The Germans didn't have. So as a consequence, they would suffer more of environmental factors than the Romans, and this is what it really means. Here the thing that has always interested me is that the Germans weren't good if they lacked wine. They weren't good at war if they lacked wine, which is something terribly nice, because there is the stereotype of these drunken barbarians who were always drinking stuff. And telling the truth, this is also rationalizable, can be also rationalized in the sense that wine was a very energetic, is a very energetic drink. Remember about the story of the charges, that they couldn't last on the field as a body. For political and logistical reasons for some time, for a certain time. Well, this is it. I mean, if they probably used wine to push themselves to do these charges, even probably drunk, because you have to think about the psychological pressure of such a thing. It's typical for many for many warriors in history to be either drugged or drunk when going into battle, because that was a way to make them feel less pain and to have an immediate amount of expendable energy, which is wine makes you do, so that it was perfectly fit for the German capabilities to charge and to keep their bodies up to a prolonged strife, at least at once. And I think the rationalization here, it's brilliantly exposed by that the Germans can suffer very much of the postponement of the battle, because this basically the manual is saying let them wear them down, essentially. Let them suffer of attrition and let them starve, because we know that they don't have a good logistics. and so they will succumb even without fighting. Here it says, in the case of a cavalry battle, they are hampered by irregular or wooded terrain. Well, who isn't? And this is strange. I mean, obviously cavalry doesn't work well on irregular or wooded terrain. Here the author of the Strategikon is basically probably doing a compliment to the ability of the Roman cavalry and its order on at least on irregular terrain, because on wooded terrain no cavalry is really good. You know, maybe just in the Gladiator movie you can find a cavalry charge carried out through a forest, but it's not really how it really works. There it says they can easily be attacked by surprise on the flanks and shoulders of their battle line, since they do not bother to use scouts or nor other security measures at all. This is very interesting because it's probably true. The Germans did. It's not that they were stupid for not doing so. It's just that it was already something if they could put an army together, because pitched battles would be something rare, and the general organization of this whole stuff was probably poorer than the Roman ones, so that they were quite used by centuries of very high military tradition to scout, to have a great reconnaissance system and a great great preparation in all things military. So here, as a consequence, it says that the Germans suffered of attack on the flanks of the shoulders because they didn't have any good scouting that could prevent ambushes most of the times. And this reconfirms the stereotype that the Germans believed in this ritualized warfare, that the only manly way of fighting was face to face. Then it says, their lines are easily broken with a fake escape and a subsequent sudden counterattack. Yeah, I'm trying to... yeah, this is what also another typical tactics that Romans were using at the time. That is the fake. There is a feint, you know, basically attracting the Germans, especially in certain particular sectors, by fake escape, and therefore breaking their line. Because these guys would be so impetuous in their charge that if they saw the enemy breaking, they would continue pursuing them. And this would bring, obviously, to the destruction of battle line, because a segment of this would go ahead and leaving the others behind, and this could create a gap in the formation that the Romans could exploit. And even here, the sudden Roman counterattack was advised, so this is more instead, it's not much of a formation thing, but really more of a psychological aspect of the thing, because the sudden counterattack here is meant as something unexpected. So maybe these Germans, by pursuing the enemy, had already broken lines, and they could be easily defeated just because of their poor order at that point. There it says, night attacks conducted by archers often inflict damage, since they are very disorganized in building the camp. Yeah, here it's interesting because I don't see here a real logical relation. I mean, night attacks conducted by archers often inflict damage. Why? Because they're disorganized in building the camp. Well, let's say that, yeah, it's obvious that if they don't have a good camp, if it's poorly built, maybe it doesn't have walls, etc., it's easier to attack with arrows, especially during night when you don't see where the enemy is and you can't pursue them. So yeah, you could kind of create a mess in the whole thing, so that they will kind of um, go crazy figuring out who is attacking them. That's the kind of reason. Then the other paragraph says, therefore, in waging war, one must above all avoid engaging them in field battle. This is very interesting, especially in the early stages. And here it reconfirms one thing, that actually the Romans feared the Germans attacking in field battle. So it's not that they're saying the Germans don't have order, hence it's easy to fight them in field battle. On the contrary, they're very dangerous. You should avoid a direct confrontation, because with their charges, implicitly here it's not saying it, but the sense is this: they can wipe you out. And this is what the Romans actually knew since a long time. And here it says, especially in the early stages, therefore pushing on the attrition pattern. That means wear them down first and then meet them in open field. So when they're weaker and they have less cohesion. Then it says, instead, well-organized ambushes, stealth attacks and stratagems must be used. Yes, this is preferable. So once again, attrition warfare, guerrilla warfare, and take them in a way they can't react, because they're not used generally to react to that. Obviously it's very stereotypical, because the Germans would be perfectly able to make ambushes, stealth attacks and stratagems, maybe other stratagems not so much, but generally speaking they could. So maybe here it's a bit of a cliche of which ethnography is rich, but probably it also stresses that in certain parts the ritual Germanic warfare was still having an influence on Germanic warfare in many ways, and that it is. Then on our advice, take time and nullify their opportunities. Good advice. This can really work in many ways against other peoples, and depending on the situation. Then pretend to make agreements with them. Aim at cooling their audacity and their ardor with lack of supplies, or with their discomfort of the heat or cold. Yes, it's basically repeating what I was saying before. That the Germans lack supply, suffer of heat and cold, etc. Then it says, this can be achieved when our army has placed the camp on difficult and irregular terrain. On this type of terrain, this enemy cannot successfully attack because it makes use of spears. This is very interesting, because remember what we were saying regarding the Germanic equipment before, to which the sword is not named as the main battle as primary weapon. Well, here basically says that the Germans are not prone to attack on irregular terrain because they make use of spears. Now this might mean quite interestingly that these formations, the Germanic formations, were actually ordered in some fashion, because using spears and as we've seen, making a compact uniform front does require a bit of a collective training and ability, and marching on irregular terrain can break this formation. So this is what the Germans are not very willing to do. Actually, in turns, it's saying that the Germans at this point cannot keep a good order on such terrain, while before implicitly the Byzantines were saying that even the Roman cavalry could have a good terrain, a good order on irregular terrain. So this could be interpreted also in this fashion, but it's still interesting that the Germans recognized the importance of the order of their ranks in many ways, at least at that level. which also is a bit against the stereotype of poor order of the same Germans. So here, I mean, there are many reasons from this chapter to think that the Germans weren't extremely disordered as this in certain parts this work suggests. Then finally, it says, but if the opportunity for a regular battle arises, set up the army as indicated earlier in the formations book. And then there are certain certain tactics that were aforementioned and that were being suggested to be used against the blonde-haired peoples. So here it's done, and I would like to go instead at the end with the Italian maneuver. Now the Italian maneuver here, as I was saying, it's important because if the Byzantines were describing the Longobards in the way we have seen, it's possible maybe to think that such a maneuver was meant to be the standard one used against the same Longobards in Italy, and that can be useful to understand their tactics as well. But it's a bit of speculation because, as I was saying before, yeah, this is the Italian maneuver, but it doesn't mean that it's good just to be used into Italy. Maybe it's called the Italian maneuver because it was used at the time of the war against the Goths, although the Goths weren't that different from the Longobards, seemingly. We haven't excluded the idea that maybe the blonde-haired peoples comprehended altogether in the Goths, even if they had been wiped out in Italy at this time, and that this was meant to have a certain continuity even in the against the Longobards and or maybe the Franks. However, here it says the Italian system consists of both in a formation and a maneuver, which we believe can be used against any enemy. This is important because it's more of a tactical, standard formation than a specifically dedicated tactics to meet an enemy, a particular enemy. It is articulated on two lines, one in the front and one in support, with cursores and defensores, that I will explain what it means, with flankers, encirclers and ambush teams, as already explained before and illustrated by the diagrams. So it basically is saying that there are two lines or two ranks, as you wanna, two battle lines essentially. One in the front, one that is essentially supporting. We don't know whether just behind or maybe on the flank, but I think behind. With cursores and defensores, who are these guys? Well, the cursores are meant to be like the runners. So these guys were like, they probably carried out hit-and-run tactics. They were skirmishers, quite light mobile troops. And defensores instead were the defenders. This is what it means. So probably heavier troops. And I don't know if it is actually referring to the single two lines, each one, or if this is something more, if it is within, this differentiation is also within the same lines. But it also says that there are flankers and encirclers and ambush teams, so probably guys that gravitated around the two lines and weren't really part of them, probably even lighter troops. And it says, as already explained before and illustrated by diagrams. Now I don't have time to go look at that, but that's still the meaning. And then it says, in general, you should practice all these types of maneuvers. It's referring to the ones he also mentioned before, I believe, so that the enemy does not understand which of these is the most important for us. I mean, not just these Italian tactics, but also the previous ones. Or when training the first line, the second line should not be on the field with her, but alone and without flankers, encircling and ambush teams. Now this is a very generic advice. It's basically saying that when you're training the troops for performing such a tactics, you should get used the troops not to rely too heavily on the supports. So without flankers, encirclers and ambush teams. That is, let them solve the problems by themselves if they can. Then if in a real battle you'll have the support of those guys, it's fine, but in the training just let them show what it can happen in the worst of occasions. Then it says, referring to the Italian maneuver, this seems to us the simplest and most basic plan. And indeed it is very simple as a tactics. In addition, in place of the second line, you can use a few cavalrymen to represent it, so that the troops of the first line can get used to the distance to keep in order to be safe. Similarly, the second line can be trained alone with a few troops placed in place of the first line, so that the second line can train itself to receive the first line when necessary. So what does it really mean? Well, from the perspective of the first line in training, what you can do is having a few guys in support, a bit like before, like saying train the first line to act with a few support on the back, so that you can get them used to difficult situations and think at keeping the right distance in order to be safe. Maybe also suggesting that there was a bit of an interaction of these two lines, maybe on the flanks, I don't know. I'm just speculating completely in here. But probably it can be also interpreted in the sense that if you have a fewer guys in the back, it's as if you didn't feel as if you had a protection behind. And we know that men are comforted by the idea of a closeness, the closeness of companions or another mass of soldiers that can intervene in their favor. Similarly, from the second line perspective, you can have you can put in training a few troops in the first line, so that the second line can train itself to receive the first line when necessary. This means one thing that is basically, according to me, but I'm also speculating, that the first line at this point is being simulated as already under strength, maybe having been worn out by the enemy already, so that it would be easier to incorporate these guys into the ranks of the second, or letting them passing behind. Because normally the first line, at least from what it says here, was not meant to go back to the second. So it was practically saying that let's simulate that those guys are already in part dead, and you can incorporate their leftovers, let's say, into your ranks or behind. And sometimes this was a bit sibylline, but this is the interpretation I have. If you have any other thought, just let me know. So I hope it was interesting. You can read the Strategikon. I love it personally, and it says really a big deal of interesting things. This video, as I was recalling, was mostly a video about Lombard warfare, as you probably understood. But I tried to put a bit of differentiated contents, and I hope it was interesting. So, if you like this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive further contents of mine, and as always I thank you heartily once again. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.